now start to encroach on Bosnian territory.
Croatia's success in Krajina has been brought about with a strategic alliance with Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think this would be killing the success that has allowed both of us to more successfully address the aggression that's coming from Serbia and Montenegro. Beyond that, I think the long-term strategic interests of the two countries, logic, geopolitics, history, dictate that this strategic alliance continues rather than, in fact, victimize Croatia now becoming a menace.
Well, you brought up the long term. In fact, we have heard reports this week that President Tudjman sketched on the back of a menu at a banquet plans to eventually carve up Bosnia between him and Serbia.
First of all, I think that question should be asked of President Tudjman as to, in fact, did he do that? And second, I have received assurances from the Croatian government that this is not their position. My counterpart, Foreign Minister Mate Granic, and I have enjoyed a very good working relationship. And on that basis, I can trust that the assurances that were made are real.
Indeed, we saw evidence today of that goodwill which you talk about between President Tudjman and President Izetbegovic. What did they decide?
The talks will continue tomorrow. There were some talks today. I think some ideas were put forth. I'll actually be involved in some preliminary talks as well over the next few hours, and then hopefully tomorrow we will see further positive results. But the most important result is that today we had the first humanitarian convoy reach the people of Bihać, and I just came from there. The psychological situation is dramatically improved. They've gone from being, if I can call it, ducks in a barrel, to people who can feel that for the first time they're out of physical danger, but on the other hand, they're in really very difficult condition in terms of their need for food, medicine, and other essentials of life.
Moving on to the Krajina crisis, there have been reports that Bosnian troops fighting in alliance with their Croatian allies have shelled roads jammed with Serbian refugees, and indeed Bosnian troops have been accused of burning Serbian villages.
We have no Bosnian troops in a position to do that. Our forces are very far away from that, so it's physically impossible to do what you're saying.
And finally, tomorrow the Bosnian government is meeting to discuss the resignation issue of the Prime Minister Haris Silajic. He is said to have differences with you and President Izetbegovic. Do these differences indicate policy differences?
I believe they're more indicative of a different fashion of doing business, and I consider that most of us consider what the Prime Minister has done here was, in fact, not a sincere resignation, but an attempt at greater power. I hate to be so blunt about it, but there is no difference in philosophy about what the future of our country looks about beyond that we must protect democracy, and power cannot be concentrated in the hands of one man. It needs to be distributed among many authorities, and in a time of war, it is essential that our government work with authority vested in those hands which are best able to execute the policies of our parliament and, of course, the wishes of our people.
Will you be amongst those demanding that he withdraw his resignation?
I have, because there is also a strong feeling that the Prime Minister has something positive to contribute. But I think we need him to think as a team player rather than someone who can dictate, including to the threat of resignation.
Bosnia's Foreign Minister talking to me a short time ago. After the break, a full news...
Tonight, some refugees were on their way to Serbia after being evacuated by the UN. Under the ceasefire agreement, the Serbs are handing over their weapons at UN collection points in the towns of Topusko and Glina in return for a safe passage. But heavy fighting earlier today around Dvor has trapped thousands of refugees who were heading for northern Bosnia. The UN is also reporting atrocities against mentally and physically handicapped civilians. We have two reports from Ben Brown on the Serb response to the refugee crisis, but first from Matthew Amroliwala on the latest situation in Krajina.
No ceasefire around the pocket of Dvor. Croat forces move from house to house, flushing out Serbian rebels still resisting in northern Krajina. Every attempt by the UN to stop the bloodshed has failed. This border town and the villages around it still echo to the sounds of gunfire and artillery shells. Thousands of refugees are trapped in the middle of all this, and it's in this region the UN has reports of more atrocities. Danish peacekeepers say 5 handicapped people were effectively executed in front of them. Bosnian government troops who are also fighting here are being accused.
Our reaction to any such activity is that it's monstrous, inhumane, against all laws of war and civilization.
Are you in any doubt that an incident of an atrocity of some kind took place?
Oh, there's no doubt that at least one atrocity took place. No doubt of that. And there may have been others. That's what we're trying to find out.
In Topushko, though, where another 30,000 refugees had effectively been held hostage, the ceasefire did work. These people were offered safe passage. In return, the Serbs had to hand over weapons. They did, and lots of them. Mostly heavy weaponry, the Croats had no intention of allowing them to be used against them again. The 2 UN collection points set up in North Kraina were quickly filled. The problem then for the UN was getting the refugees out without endangering them further. With human rights abuses and continued fighting around Davor, the UN eventually abandoned its plans this afternoon to take refugees out via that route. Instead, a second, much safer route was opened up. Thousands were able to drive north towards Serbia itself. In front of them, relative safety. Behind them, virtually everything that had been their lives. The UN now has to try and get the 15,000 people in Davor out, something very much harder. Matthew Amreliwala, BBC News, Zagreb.
Tens of thousands of refugees have continued to stream into northern Bosnia, many arriving in the town of Banja Luka, where aid is now urgently needed. As the humanitarian crisis worsens, the president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, has blamed defeat in Krajina on the Bosnian Serbs for refusing to accept the international peace plan 2 years ago.
The Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic put on a show of solidarity today with his Croatian counterpart Milan Martic, the self-styled president of the Krajina Serbs, until their army was routed last weekend. Dr. Karadzic issued a chilling threat that there will be no peace for hundreds of years until Serbs get back Krajina. He's blamed Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia, for allowing the defeat of the Krajina Serbs. He's written an open letter accusing Mr. Milosevic of cynical treachery and deception. Not surprisingly, Dr. Karadzic hasn't yet had a reply.
No, nothing.
Nothing.
While Serb leaders squabble, Serb people suffer. These refugees from Krajina are facing worsening conditions as tens of thousands of them cram into Bosnian towns like Banja Luka. Airlifts are about to begin to get supplies to them. Land convoys have had trouble getting through because the roads are so clogged with the cars of refugees. Many of those who have fled are so appalled by the conditions in Bosnia and so fearful they'll get caught up in further fighting there that they are heading straight for Serbia itself. But some observers are wondering whether Serbia too could soon be at war with the Croats. President Milosevic has sent an armoured division to the border of eastern Slavonia, the last Serb enclave in Croatia, which he fears could be the next target of the Croat president Franjo Tuđman. If there is to be a wider war between Serbs and Croats, then almost certainly it will start in the fertile plains of eastern Slavonia. The recent military build-up in this area is a game of brinkmanship between both Presidents Milosevic and Tuđman, but ultimately neither man wants confrontation with the other. Ben Brown, BBC News, Serbia.
The Yorkshire Water Company has begun the first...
The last of the Croats from the land they control in central Bosnia. The United Nations says hundreds have been forced out of the Bosnian Serb stronghold of Banja Luka and bused to Davor on the Croatian border. Thousands more are expected to follow. But the UN says some Croat men are being held back. At another of their strongholds, Donji Vakuf, Bosnian Serb troops are holding off an assault by Bosnian government forces.
The Bosnian Serbs, in need of some good news on the military front, are celebrating what they say is the successful defence of their southern borders. The initial assault came in the early hours of Saturday, through these valleys close to the town of Donji Vakuf. This colonel told us that the Bosnian government forces had suffered heavy losses. They expected heavy casualties, he said, but they didn't expect to be pushed back in a counter-offensive yesterday morning. On the top of a ridge, we were shown the Bosnian government lines, according to the Bosnian Serbs, back where they started from. At this point, the Bosnian Serbs seem to have held their line, although it was broken in a few places further along. According to the Bosnian Serbs, after a 15-hour offensive, they managed to beat back the attack and regain their original lines. The morale of the Bosnian Serb soldiers is likely to have been seriously dented by recent military setbacks and the comprehensive defeat of their allies in Krajina. They're expecting probing attacks at several places on their borders, mainly designed to test their resolve. Artillery exchanges are still going on sporadically here. Several rounds have fallen in the town of Donji Vakuv, which was thought to be the target of the Bosnian government offensive. Further to the north in Banja Luka, international aid agencies reported that hundreds of Croats were being escorted from their homes and taken towards the Croatian border.
After 3 years of murder, intimidation, expulsion and harassment, and the systematic blowing up of more than 200 mosques in the Banja Luka region, this seems to be the final effort of the Bosnian Serbs to achieve their goal of ethnic purity in the Banja Luka region.
As this latest wave of refugees crossed the river Sava into Croatia, there were fears for the safety of about 50,000 Croats and Muslims left behind. But these are yet another group of people in the former Yugoslavia with a very uncertain future. John Devitt, BBC News, Banja Luka.
Assess their impact and the Bosnian Serbs a chance to consider their options. There have been hints that the Serbs may now be willing to withdraw heavy weapons from around Sarajevo. This afternoon, the UN commander in the former Yugoslavia, General Bernard Janvier, met the Bosnian Serb commander, General Mladic, and demanded an end to all Bosnian Serb attacks. The chief American peace negotiator, Richard Holbrooke, is to brief the other countries closely involved in the former Yugoslavia on his talks with Serb leaders, which appear to have been making some progress.
The American war machine has fallen silent, the planes grounded until tomorrow morning. This may be a NATO operation, but it's America who's doing all the running, and our allies are increasingly concerned about where it's all leading. The Serbs say the UN is no longer a peacekeeper and is now waging war against them. Officials are showing signs of concern.
I hope we still are a peacekeeping force. We try our best to maintain our impartiality. We try our best not to become a party in this conflict.
The politicians are still insisting that this operation is only designed to lift the Serbian siege of Sarajevo. But the results of the airstrikes have been devastating. In 3 days, NATO has done more to weaken the Bosnian Serbs than the Muslims have achieved in 3 years of war. The temptation to keep on pushing until the Serbs agree to negotiate has been overwhelming. The Bosnian Serb military is certainly feeling the pressure. It was General Mladic who requested today's meeting with the UN High Command. And whatever is being said officially, the military assault is being closely coordinated with the American diplomatic initiative. America's chief negotiator, Richard Holbrooke, says that everyone is now finally negotiating in earnest.
We're talking about the map, about constitutional issues, about economic reconstruction, about these issues. I am not going to discuss any of the negotiating details today, but I will say that these are serious talks, and there is a possibility, although it's going to be difficult, that we can make progress.
The Bosnian Serbs say that they are willing to surrender some of their land, but in return they are making demands of their own. These include a wider corridor in the north, a partition of Sarajevo, and access to the sea. The success of these talks all hinge on whether the two key Serbian players, President Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic, can work together. They don't, in fact, have much choice. The Americans have warned them that if they leave the negotiating table, they can only expect more airstrikes. Tom Carver, BBC News.
The NATO operation is supposed to be on hold, but this afternoon the big guns of the Rapid Reaction Force have been shelling a Bosnian Serb mortar position. The Serbs have been warned that if they fire first, they'll still be fired upon. Otherwise, though, there is a pause in the NATO air and artillery bombardment.
There'd always been a thought there would be a requirement for a pause after maybe about 48 hours in order to allow them a break to just get their thoughts together in a slightly more ordered climate than having perpetual bombing come upon them. And that's the purpose of this, just to give them a better climate, a more benign climate, to think clearly and come up with an answer to our demands.
NATO warplanes could still be spotted in the skies today, for now though carrying out reconnaissance rather than airstrikes. The 24-hour pause timed to coincide with a critical meeting between the Bosnian Serb commander, General Ratko Mladic, and the head of the UN peacekeeping forces here, General Bernard Janvier. But in Sarajevo, the government fears the Bosnian Serbs and their heavy weapons are being let off the hook.
We're asking for that killing machine, that machine of terrorism, and you've all seen the results of that terrorism, to be neutralized. And there still has not been a commitment on the part of the Serbians to neutralize or remove that terrorist machine.
It's a machine the Radelkovic family know all about. Zvonimir and Ivanka and their teenage son Gigo live right on the corner of Sniper Alley. They can't even cross the road to their home without the UN's protection. The Serbs are only 400 yards away. For 3 years, shells and bullets have rained down around their home. But now this family told me they dare to hope that the darkest days are over.
The very important thing is to set us free from fear, because you couldn't go out without thinking, will I come back? Will my family come back? Will my husband or son come back?
I think that people have reached the breaking point. You carry on in impossible conditions for such a long time, but finally you have to reach a point where you must say, I cannot do it any longer.
But at the scene of Monday's marketplace massacre, there's hope that the horror here has produced enough decisive Western action to lift the siege of the city. In 1 week, Sarajevo has been transformed from utter despair on Monday, when dozens of people lay dead or dying in this street, to a new sense of hope and expectation on Friday. The people of this city will tell you they feel deeply grateful to NATO and the United Nations for what they have done, but also deeply angry it has taken so long. Ben Brown, BBC News, Sarajevo.
Full backing to the new wave of NATO airstrikes against Bosnian Serb positions near Sarajevo and Pale. The UN says the strikes will continue until the Bosnian Serbs withdraw their heavy weapons from around the Bosnian capital. All parties to the war are due to meet later this week in the search for a peaceful settlement.
NATO commanders ran out of patience today, and at lunchtime we watched their warplanes flying low over Bosnian Serb territory to hit targets near Sarajevo and elsewhere. Clouds of smoke billowed on the horizon when the Lukavica barracks took a direct hit. What looked like a vehicle compound was destroyed instantly. The Bosnian Serbs thought they'd done enough last night to escape more airstrikes, but they had miscalculated, and their game of brinkmanship had backfired. Inside Sarajevo, though, the first fear was that the Serbs would retaliate, so the air raid siren sounded and the people ran for cover. But in the end, there were no attacks on the city. Nonetheless, the Bosnian Serb commander, General Mladic, was still sounding defiant today.
The more they bombard us, the stronger we are. They can cause destruction and violence, but we are on our land and we will win.
Last night, General Mladic belatedly ordered some of his heavy weapons and tanks to pull back from Sarajevo. Far too few, though, to meet the terms of the UN-NATO ultimatum, which insists that a significant number of Bosnian Serb big guns must not only move, but get out of the 12-mile weapons exclusion zone.
They try to hide their heavy weapons in the residential areas, in the woods, and I hope that the airstrikes will continue until they comply with all the requests.
What isn't yet clear is whether NATO will now suspend their airstrikes as they did before to give General Mladic a pause for thought, or whether they'll simply carry on and bomb the Bosnian Serbs into submission. NATO insist they have no shortage of targets. And today the Serbs have been attacked not only from the air but also on the ground by British troops with the Rapid Reaction Force on Mount Igman. These are the first pictures of them opening fire on Serb positions. Troops from the Devon and Dorset Regiment had been called in to finish off an artillery bunker, which had already been bombed. They fire more than 3 dozen 40mm rounds.
Get fire! The round.
The soldiers watch and wait to see what damage they've done.
He's right at the end of his range, though, isn't he?
The Devon and Dorsets keep firing relentlessly, and a heavily camouflaged British sniper joins in for good measure. These troops are engaged in peace enforcement, but for the moment it's hard to escape the conclusion that they are also at war with the Bosnian Serbs. Ben Brown, BBC News, Sarajevo.
Serious Bosnian peace talks for 2 years have ended with an agreement that could move the country closer to peace. What is now Bosnia would be divided into two entities, one governed by Muslims and Croats, the other by the Serbs. They'd be almost equal in size. At the moment, the Serbs control about 2/3 of the territory. But the details of how the new map would look haven't been agreed. That's one of many problems which still lie ahead. But one of the negotiators at the talks in Geneva said today's agreement could be the dawn of peace.
After 2 years without any meaningful talks to end the Bosnian war, just restarting negotiations represented a major achievement. What made it possible is the emergence of the Yugoslav government as a spokesman for the Bosnian Serbs. What has to be seen is whether the Bosnian Serbs will accept agreements made on their behalf. The Bosnian Foreign Minister, Mohamed Sakabi, offered his Yugoslav counterpart a reluctant handshake and struck a deal on a set of common principles, set out by the US envoy who chaired the negotiations.
The statement we are issuing today is an important milestone in the search for peace. Today's statement contains many significant points. Within its current internationally recognized borders, it is agreed in the statement that Bosnia and Herzegovina will be comprised of two democratic entities, the existing Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska. Bosnian territory will be divided, as you already know, the Federation with 51% and the Serbian entity with 49%.
Although the statement had been agreed in advance, the delegates spent much of the day trying to change the wording to their advantage. It was a foretaste of the problems ahead, as the principles have to be turned into practical details. The contact group representatives peppered their comments with warnings about how much the document depended on interpretation, and how difficult it would be to talk the Serbs back from territory they'd captured.
The parties need to define their internal borders within Bosnia in accordance with the 51-49 principle. We should be under no illusions that these will be easy tasks. They can be solved only through intense negotiations backed by a genuine desire to achieve peace. Finally, any agreement must be implemented by all sides, and this could be the hardest part of all.
Well, our correspondent Ben Brown is in Sarajevo. Ben, the hardest part of all, is this thing doable, do you think?
Well, it's very difficult to tell. As Brian was saying, it really does depend on the reaction of the Bosnian Serb leadership. And the problem with that leadership is that it's so deeply divided at the moment. It is in disarray. There is a power struggle going on. We've seen evidence of it in the last few weeks, a power struggle between General Mladic in charge of the army and Dr. Karadzic in charge of the political leadership. So we have to wait to see whether the Bosnian Serbs are going to endorse this deal. And within the last half hour, in fact, rogue elements within the Bosnian Serb army have fired a shell into Sarajevo, injuring 4 people, 3 of them children. And that was within minutes of Mr. Holbrooke's announcement in Geneva. Whether that's a coincidence or an answer to what was said in Geneva, we don't know.
But probably not. It would have been very close, wouldn't it, to the announcement from Geneva if that was a direct response?
It could well have been a response from people in the Bosnian Serb army who don't want to give up territory. After all, the Bosnian Serbs have 70% of territory in Bosnia-Herzegovina at the moment. Under the peace deal, they're going to be asked to surrender, well, at least 20% of it.
I've just heard that Brian Hanrahan, our diplomatic correspondent, is in Geneva and on the line there. Brian, you've been at a number of these peace talks in the past. They've all ended in failure. What was the sense at this one, that it might work?
Well, I don't think anyone is going to put themselves out and guarantee that. What they are saying is that they are now talking, but almost everything in this agreement still has to be defined. They haven't defined the territory, they haven't written the constitution, they haven't set out the safeguards. All they have set out are some principles. Now, those principles have been around for a year or so. They've been agreed by almost everybody except the Bosnian Serbs. This time we're told the Bosnian Serbs are prepared to underwrite them, but we don't hear anything from them, and we certainly don't know that they are actually ready to go along with the details when it comes to fitting them into some kind of framework.
Because, of course, neither Karadzic nor Mladic were at those talks.
they couldn't come here because they're both wanted for war crimes and would be subject to arrest. And also there's a problem of whether anybody would be prepared to talk to them. One of the other complications in this is that Mr. Holbrooke made it quite clear that the war crimes process goes on. That was not discussed today. It isn't going to be stopped, and that is something which is clearly going to inhibit the leaders of the Bosnian Serbs from wanting to make an agreement that would put them within the jurisdiction of the Western powers.
So Ben Brown in Sarajevo, when do you think we might get a response?
From the Bosnian Serbs, well, it's difficult to tell, but I think we could expect one within a few hours on Bosnian Serb television, and certainly the Bosnian President, Alija Izetbegović, is going on television here in Sarajevo tonight. But I do think in the long term, as usual with these agreements, the devil is in the detail. It's all about the map. For example, are the Bosnian government going to be prepared to give up Gorazde, which is thought to be one of the American proposals? Are the Serbs going to give up their claims on parts of Sarajevo? That is where the carve-up has to be done on the map.
Ben Brown and Brian Hanrahan, thank you both.
Diplomatic breakthrough in the confrontation over Sarajevo. The American envoy Richard Holbrooke has been involved in a hectic round of talks and says he's making progress on a deal that would relieve the siege of the city. The diplomatic moves have been accompanied by rapid changes on the field of battle, with big gains being made by Croat and Muslim forces from their Serb enemies. This report from Martin Bell.
Peace in our time, believe it when it happens. The latest peace moves follow the most rapid advance by any army in 3.5 years of war. The victorious troops are Bosnian Croats, backed by main force units from Zagreb. With assistance from the Muslims further south, they swept through and captured the fortified town of Jajce, which Croats and Muslims used to share before losing it to the Serbs 3 years ago. Now the tides of war have turned. In Bosnia, you know when a town's been fought for and when it hasn't. This one hadn't. Serbian resistance didn't collapse, it wasn't even offered. Jajce is the largest of 4 towns which fell yesterday to the advancing Federation forces, mainly Muslims and Croats. It stands across the main road from Sarajevo to Bihać and supplies power to Banja Luka, the largest city in Serbian-held Bosnia. This Serbian heartland is now flooded with refugees escaping from the fallen towns in anything with wheels. 50,000 of them may be on the road. It's the 3rd Serbian exodus in as many months. The Serbs are not only tired of the war, but losing it, and maybe in a mood to settle. Certainly, the chief American negotiator, Richard Holbrooke, changed his traveling plans after a long session last night with the Serbian president, Mr. Milosevic.
He asked us to convey, on behalf of the Serbian side, an important message to General Janvier and Mr. Kashi, which we also informed President Tudjman of, concerning the possibility of a cessation of hostilities in the Sarajevo airport.
Ready, charge, 3!
According to sources close to the negotiation, the plan is to replace British and French troops on Mount Igman with Italians and Russians more acceptable to the Serbs, who would then withdraw their heavy weapons. Washington is optimistic that a deal can be struck.
There have been some reason to hope for progress in the last several hours, beginning last night our time, but we're not prepared to make a final announcement yet. When we are, we will, and we'll answer all the questions.
There may now be a pause in the NATO attacks, this one on a Serbian ammunition dump 2 days ago. There's a price to be paid. The Serbs say that 27 of their people were killed and 140 wounded in a raid on the north-central town of Doboj. They're taking a hammering now from NATO in the air and the Croats especially on the ground. But the military and diplomatic stalemate seems to be breaking. Martin Bell, BBC News.
I'm joined now from Sarajevo by our correspondent Ben Brown. Ben, we heard President Clinton there talking of the fact that he only hoped for progress. Is there a feeling on the ground in Sarajevo that a deal has been struck to remove the heavy weapons from around the city?
Yes, I think it seems like we might be nearer to a deal than we have been at any time since this crisis blew up. Certainly, NATO we've had that confirmed that they have paused for 12 hours their bombing campaign, and it does look like the Bosnian Serbs are prepared at least to talk about withdrawing their weapons, subject to certain conditions.
And is it practical to replace the British and French troops with the Russians and Italians?
Well, as far as the Bosnian government here in Sarajevo are concerned, I don't think they'll want to see Russians on the streets of their city. It may please the Bosnian Serbs, but the Bosnian government see the Russians as Serb stooges, Serb allies, Serb sympathizers, and they won't be happy with that at all.
But would they accept the Russians, for example, on Mount Igman, outside the city?
Well, I think they may be forced to in the end. The Americans, if they really want to push through this, this peace plan for Sarajevo at least, will have to force the Bosnian government to accept Russians, even if they don't want to. And I think the Americans do have quite a lot of leverage at the moment on the Bosnian government.
There have been suggestions today that NATO plans to take over from the United Nations as peace enforcers in Bosnia. Is there any truth in that?
Well, we've had a briefing here from a highly placed diplomatic source who gave us the scenario, according to Richard Holbrooke, the American peace envoy, which is that he gets a deal, a peace deal, overall peace deal done by September the 25th. And then, for the next 6 months, the United Nations start to withdraw, and they are replaced by NATO peacekeepers. And the feeling is that NATO, because of what they've done, the very tough actions they've done over the last couple of weeks with airstrikes and cruise missile attacks, the feeling is they would be much more respected as peacekeepers in this part of the world than United Nations troops.
And briefly, Ben, if this comes off, what are the chances of it being a major step towards an overall peace in Bosnia?
Well, I think Richard Holbrooke certainly feels that, at least he feels that he is very close to an overall peace agreement. And as I say, he's talking about a deadline of September the 25th, which is only 11 days away.
Ben, thanks very much indeed.
She is a symbol of hope that the Bosnian Serbs might finally be lifting their siege. NATO says the Serbs have begun gathering their heavy weapons, ready to pull them back, but these movements do not yet constitute withdrawal. Tonight, the five-power contact group is meeting in Geneva to consider the next steps in the American-brokered peace process. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Gabby Rado, assesses today's developments and examines the obstacles which still stand in the way of an overall peace.
The symbolism was irresistible. The first plane to land at Sarajevo airport for a very long time brought with it perhaps the best hope since the Bosnian conflict began that some kind of peace settlement was in sight. The safe landing was the first concrete result of the agreement between NATO and the Bosnian Serbs, which led to the suspension of 2 weeks of air bombardment. But it was more of a gesture than anything else, as the French transport plane carried far more foreign officials than aid. Among those on the tarmac was the British commander, General Rupert Smith, his face showing his relief at what's clearly an important breakthrough. Not far away, a French army unit had the unfamiliar experience of being allowed through a Serbian checkpoint. The French were on their way to escort an aid convoy into Sarajevo by tarmac road, avoiding the hazardous mountain route, again a sign that the Bosnian Serbs were complying with NATO's demands.
We have accepted a specific proposal made by President Milosevic and offered to Mr. Holbrooke about cessation of hostilities agreement in the zone of Sarajevo. In that context, we are ready to withdraw heavy weaponry and to relocate it on the edge of the zone of 20 kilometers.
And finally, visual proof that the Bosnian Serbs are gathering heavy weapons ready for withdrawal. 3 tanks and several heavy guns were filmed a few miles south of Sarajevo, heading out of the exclusion zone. They've been given a total of 6 days for the pullout, 3 to show progress and 3 to complete the exercise. But there was some concern that the deal didn't include smaller mortars and anti-aircraft guns, which could allow a resumption of shelling if the ceasefire broke down.
The view was perhaps taken, we had to get the Serbs to sign this. They have a point that, you know, we cannot denude them militarily. They do have a population sitting around Sarajevo that has a legitimate concern that without no military cover, it could face a very uncertain future. And therefore, to achieve something, there has been a degree of compromise. That said, we are trying actually to bring the caliber down a little bit further.
This morning in Mostar, the American negotiator Richard Holbrooke was still busy persuading the Bosnian President Alija Izetbegovic to give his blessing to the deal. There's a danger that a ceasefire would mean freezing lines of confrontation inside Sarajevo, effectively splitting the capital in 2.
Concerning Sarajevo, we agree that Sarajevo must remain a united city. We will never accept the dividing of the city.
The fresh military successes of the Bosnian government army in the central and western areas of the country are now giving the Sarajevo leadership the feeling, perhaps for the first time in the conflict, that it can lay down some of its own conditions. If the agreement in Sarajevo is, in the coming days, to be followed by an attempt to draw up an overall framework for peace,
This newly found confidence may become an obstacle. The Bosnian government has long insisted that much of eastern Bosnia, now almost entirely Serb-occupied, must be returned to it. The dramatic turnaround in the balance of power in Bosnia is shown by one look at the map. For more than 3 years, the Serbs have controlled vast swathes of land in eastern, northern and western Bosnia, making the land held by Muslims and Croats seem an unviable, broken-up rump of the country. Now, in the past few days, the Muslim-Croat alliance has routed the Bosnian Serb army, not just taking key towns and roads, but if latest reports are confirmed, linking up the Bihać enclave with the rest of government-held territory. Suddenly, it's the Serb-controlled statelet which looks ungainly and vulnerable. Before setting off on a tour of the Balkans this weekend, the British Foreign Secretary welcomed the agreement reached in Sarajevo, but warned against expecting too much at once.
I think, being realistic, we must assume that the future of the whole situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina will be 3 steps forward, 1 step back. It will not be uninterrupted progress. There will be disappointments, there will be reverses, there will be factors and incidents which will make us wonder, my God, is it all collapsing again? Are we going back to square one? I don't think it will. I think it will be 3 steps forward, 1 step back, because I think we've turned quite a significant corner in this respect.
In Moscow, the Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev claimed the agreement had been reached despite airstrikes, but expressed his government's pleasure. He said it hadn't yet been decided whether Russia would contribute troops to a new international force in Bosnia. And this evening in Sarajevo, proof that a secure land route has finally been unblocked. A UN convoy escorted by French peacekeepers arrived with several hundred tons of aid. The citizens of the devastated city, who've had their hopes raised before, now wait to see if the momentum of the past 24 hours will continue.
Gabi Rade reporting. Well, joining us now is the Bosnian ambassador to Britain, Professor Mohamed Filipovic. Ambassador, will you guarantee now not to fire your heavy weapons in the city of Sarajevo?
Of course. We accepted the deal around the Sarajevo. We didn't fire our guns during the last campaign. We stopped our campaign when NATO airstrikes has been performed. If Serbians withdraw the weapon and a city would be opened, because I don't think that city is open if only one route through the airport is opened. All routes must be opened to consider the city has been opened.
I think we do have news of land routes possibly opening up as well, but what guarantees will you give to Serb civilians in Sarajevo?
They have already all guarantees, and more than 150,000 Serbian people is living with us without any annoyances. You know, they have all rights as me, all other people, and I don't think that there are a need for some special guarantees.
Well, of course, they are in the Serb side of the city. I mean, will you countenance the divided city?
We are pity for them because they have been under the Serbian occupation and they have been under the terror. Both of them, Serbians as Bosnians. So that we expect the city will be rejoined into the one city, and it's a natural right for all the people to live in one city, and the refugees to turn back because they have been expelled forcibly for 3 years from their homes.
Indeed, we heard President Izetbegovic there saying he wouldn't countenance a divided city, but yet today we've heard Richard Holbrooke talking about a sort of Berlin Wall type scenario.
It's a silly solution. It failed all over the world wherever has been imposed, so that it has no sense to divide the Sarajevo. If anyone means real peace, he must unite the country, not divide it.
Militarily, across Bosnia, your forces are making extraordinary gains, and it's in your interest now, isn't it, to keep the war going?
No, no. We never wanted the war. Just it is a consequence of some stopping in the constant aid from Serbia, and also it is a consequence of the expansion of the Karadzic forces. We have been very sure that they cannot keep their position, and they have been fighting recently only against the civilians. You remember Srebrenica case, they killed 7,000 civilians.
Professor Filipovic, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
In Washington, President Clinton has offered qualified praise for the Bosnian Serb promise to end the siege of Sarajevo, but he warned that airstrikes would resume if they renege on the commitments. So after years of failed initiatives, how have the Americans achieved this apparent breakthrough? Our Washington correspondent David Smith reports on what the US has been offering and on what's in it for them.
Today in public, President Clinton stressed caution. Privately, the White House is buoyant, though, sensing that their strategy of bombing the Bosnian Serbs to the negotiating table is working, and working more quickly than even they'd hoped.
A lot of work remains to be done, but we are absolutely determined to press forward, to reach a settlement to this conflict, not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table. We can and we must end Bosnia's long nightmare.
The president was quick to attach a firm warning for the Bosnian Serb leadership.
Now the Bosnian Serbs must carry out their commitments and then turn their energies toward a political settlement that will end this terrible conflict for good. They should have no doubt that NATO will resume the airstrikes if they fail to keep their commitments.
The change in attitude here is so striking now. This president and his advisers, for so long the butt of such criticism for their inaction on Bosnia, today leading the international community in the search for peace. The Croats and their gains on the battlefield in the Balkans in midsummer, that provided the cue for the Americans. And White House sources said today the Croats will be rewarded if and when a new map of Bosnia is agreed. But the Americans add that the help, support and simple message sending of Serbia's President Milosevic has been key ever since. Milosevic, they say, remains critical to the process from now on. Whatever the optimism here about the Serb leadership in Belgrade, the Americans have no intention of letting up the pressure now. So there'll be more of the same strategy that's proved successful in recent weeks. The carrot, not yet publicly revealed, but very much on the table, the carrot is a piece heavily financed by Washington. And the stick, well, the stick is not just airstrikes. It's the American threat of putting Bosnian Serb leaders on trial for war crimes. The president is said to believe strongly that Bosnian Serb military chiefs such as General Mladic and the likes of Radovan Karadzic on the political front, that they should be brought to justice. And those who've been dispatched by Mr. Clinton to study past war crimes tribunals at the UN Commission in Geneva, they're insistent it can be done.
They must be brought to justice. Whether or not they will, that's obviously another question, but they've got to be stopped at the very least, and I think this is the way to stop them.
But how can you negotiate the United States with people who you ultimately want to put in war crimes tribunals?
It's a problem that's very, very different from the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. Very different. I think, I mean, I would hate to see amnesty as part of the negotiation.
As for the incentive of US economic aid, American envoy Richard Holbrooke is apparently carrying a mini Marshall Plan for the Balkans as he shuttles back and forth. Mr. Clinton's thinking on this? That a peace agreement would save America making an open-ended military commitment involving tens of thousands of US troops indefinitely, and that financial aid is an important inducement for everyone to negotiate seriously.
I think the United States is prepared to use the idea of a mini Marshall Plan as a significant carrot to tell the warring parties that there will be significant economic aid as long as there's peace, as long as there's no fighting that requires an American intervention of some sort. And again, that's how President Clinton would sell it to the American public.
What do you think is the possibility of transforming this into a permanent peace in Bosnia?
I think there's a good possibility if the parties themselves wish to do it.
So the president's reasonably optimistic. He's certainly engaged, a far cry from the indecision of the past. The most important change, however, even in the eyes of his critics, may be that his White House is proving it knows how to wield carrot and stick. To quote one commentator here today, showing the kind of streetwise savvy on the world stage that seemed beyond them a few months ago. David Smith, Channel 4 News, Washington.
Well, we're joined live from the State Department in Washington by the American government spokesman Nicholas Burns. Nicholas Burns, how hopeful are you that this agreement will stick? Because we've been hearing from the Bosnian ambassador that they will not countenance the divided city of Sarajevo.
Well, we're hopeful today as we look at this agreement, but we obviously think that verifiable compliance, verification, is going to be the key factor as we proceed through the weekend. The Bosnian Serbs now have until Sunday to withdraw a substantial number of heavy weapons from around the Sarajevo zone, and 3 days following that, all of their heavy weapons. The Bosnian Serbs have said a lot of nice things in the past. They've not always, in fact infrequently, have really made good on their promises. This time, the West will be watching very carefully, and we expect full compliance, but we're going to verify it.
The point is, though, that this is an agreement about the city of Sarajevo, and as far as its future is concerned, we've been hearing from Richard Holbrooke that he is envisaging a possible Berlin Wall scenario. Now, what I was saying is that we've been hearing in London that that is not on the cards as far as the Bosnian government is concerned.
We believe that Sarajevo has got to be the capital of any future Bosnia-Herzegovina, and we believe it's got to be a unified city. No one wants to divide that city. These are very complex constitutional and political arrangements. Sarajevo is a hotly contested city, much like Jerusalem is, in another conflict in another part of the world. And these are the issues that the parties and the contact group are going to have to negotiate quite intensively over the next couple of weeks.
Across Bosnia, we've seen an extraordinary gains on the Muslim Croat side in the last few days. This is working rather well in terms of your peace initiative, isn't it, in tandem?
Well, actually, I believe that in the past couple of days, 50,000 people have been made refugees. It's quite tragic that the Bosnian Serb population has had to flee towards Banja Luka. The United States has advised the Bosnian government and the Croatian government to be restrained in their military actions in Western Bosnia. We don't see how an escalation of fighting can contribute to the current movement towards peace. And I think all of us in the West, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and elsewhere, want this situation to be transformed from one of warfare to one of peace.
But the Bosnian government is rolling towards your 49-51 ratio, isn't it? It's actually implementing your peace plan envisaged last week.
Well, I think it's difficult to make that argument because there hasn't been a peace conference yet. The parties haven't decided who gets 51 and who gets which part of the 51, excuse me, the Bosnian government will get, and which part of the 49 the Bosnian Serbs would get. These are very complicated territorial issues.
Yeah, but the point is that there's a discrepancy.
Cannot be resolved by territorial conquest.
But there's a discrepancy at the moment in the amount of land that the Bosnian government is holding, and it's holding more than it was last week, which is moving towards your peace plan, isn't it?
Well, we certainly believe that the Bosnian government is the aggrieved party here, and the Bosnian Serbs are the ones that have been responsible for brutality. But you know, these very complex territorial arrangements are not going to be decided by fighting. They're going to have to be decided ultimately at the conference table.
Why are you more hopeful that things will stick this time where they haven't before?
Well, this time we have a joint delegation, Serb and Bosnian Serb delegation, that has put forward, really for the first time, a program for peace in the agreement that we saw last evening in Europe and in North America. And we also have the commitment now by Mr. Kardic and General Mladic that they are fully on board that agreement. That's a positive sign, but I must say, we're going to need to verify that agreement, and the Bosnian Serbs are going to need to be completely accurate and comprehensive in fulfilling it.
Nicholas Burns, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And one further development in the former Yugoslavia, the UN says it's planning to hand over 34 Serbs who are suspected of war crimes to the Croatian authorities. The Serbs have been sheltering at a UN base in Knin, the former capital of the Serb-run Krajina region, which was recaptured by Croatia last month. 700 Serb civilians who were also taking refuge in the UN base will leave Croatia at the same time.
After 3 hours to go before the NATO deadline, the Bosnian Serbs say they'll complete their withdrawal of weapons from around Sarajevo. The American peace envoy in the area says the next few hours could determine the fate of the Bosnian war. Embarrassment for immigration officials as a man told to deport himself on the Eurostar jumps from the train. And the Pope celebrates his first Mass in South Africa with a congregation of 100,000. Good evening. The Bosnian Serbs have said the withdrawal of heavy weapons from the exclusion zone around Sarajevo will be completed by tonight's deadline. The deadline runs out in 3 hours' time, and NATO has threatened further airstrikes if the Bosnian Serbs fail to comply.
Bosnian Serb compliance was the order of the day, with tanks and artillery once again paraded past the press on their way out of Sarajevo. Today's array of field guns, mortars and rocket launchers were heading beyond the town of Turnovo. But whether it'll add up to the total withdrawal being demanded by the UN won't be known until later tonight. Serb military commanders insist they are honouring their side of the bargain. This senior officer confessed that his men weren't happy about the instruction to pull back, but nevertheless they would respect and obey the wishes of their political leaders. Strengthened UN and NATO resolve appears to have persuaded these troops that any attempt by Bosnian government forces to take advantage of their absence will be punished by the Western allies. Evidence of NATO airstrikes is difficult to avoid. Just a few miles away, the wreckage of Kalinovic barracks leaves a bitter sense of frustration. Army officers claim they're being forced to fight this war with their eyes closed and their hands tied behind their backs. In the ultimate analysis, it'll be up to the UN to decide whether a sufficient number of heavy weapons have been withdrawn beyond the exclusion zone. But the Bosnian Serbs certainly feel they've done enough to prevent further airstrikes. Low-flying NATO jets act as a constant reminder that the UN's watching and counting. But Sarajevo's peace remains tenuous. Bosnian Serb leaders are already warning that heavy weapons will be rapidly redeployed at the first sign of Bosnian government aggression. Juliet Bremner, BBC News, outside Sarajevo.
The American peace envoy, Richard Holbrooke, says the next few hours could determine the fate of the Bosnian war. He was speaking in Sarajevo during efforts to achieve a peace settlement. But the war continues in northwest Bosnia, where government forces say they've made further significant gains at the expense of the Bosnian Serbs. Since the start of the latest offensive a week ago, the government and its Croat allies claim they've retaken control of territory equivalent to 8% of Bosnia's entire area.
The Bosnian Serbs have got more to worry about than just NATO airstrikes. Their demoralised army has now lost 1,500 square miles of territory. Their stronghold town of Banja Luka could soon be under threat, and even their commander, General Ratko Mladic, is reported to have been taken ill. Some estimates say 100,000 Bosnian Serb refugees are fleeing for their lives. The Serbs used to control about 2/3 of Bosnia. Now it's more like half, and the reality on the battlefield is beginning to resemble the peace plan on the map, which proposes a roughly equal carve-up of the country. Today, America's peace envoy, Richard Holbrooke, flew into Sarajevo, his plane dropping anti-missile decoy flares in case of attack by Bosnian Serbs, who've only just allowed the airport here to reopen.
Today is obviously the middle of a very critical phase in the future of this region, another crossroads between peace and war.
And he knows that at the moment it's very much war in the northwest of the country. It's thought Mr. Holbrooke may have asked Bosnia's leaders today to call off their steamroller offensive, but they have no intention of doing so because for once they say they are in the driving seat.
The best diplomacy is created on the ground. We've had to learn that lesson the hard way. Now we're the beneficiaries of that lesson.
We are entitled to liberate our territory. That's what not take, but to liberate. There is a fascist aggression upon our country, and we shall go anywhere that it requires.
There is still an impetus for peace driven by the American initiative. But now that the Bosnian government are making so many gains on the battlefield, they're no longer in such a rush to get around the negotiating table. Ben Brown, BBC News, Sarajevo.
Bosnia could jeopardize the international peace plan. The warning comes amid fears that the offensive could provoke Serbia's President Milosevic to send in his troops to help the Bosnian Serbs. Over the past week, government forces and their Croat allies have made dramatic territorial gains at the expense of the Bosnian Serbs. And there's now concern over the fate of Banja Luka, a key Serb stronghold in the region. At a joint news conference in Sarajevo with Britain's Foreign Secretary Malcolm Rifkind, Bosnia's foreign minister said his government was prepared to hold talks with the leaders of Banja Luka.
In an armoured car, the Foreign Secretary was driven to a vantage point high above Sarajevo to see for himself the damage NATO airstrikes have done to Bosnian Serb positions just below and uncomfortably close.
Is there a problem with snipers here? I mean,
no, you're all right now.
No, I don't mean that, but I mean...
In fact, at one stage today, a shot was fired within 40 metres of the Foreign Secretary, though his entourage say he was not in any danger. At this British observation post, Mr. Rifkind was shown the Lukavica barracks, NATO's favourite target before the airstrikes were suspended.